High class. This week we will lecture on the second wave of bourgeoisie revolution. The English Reformation created a strong centralized state and a new aristocracy of courtiers and estate owners. The English Revolution then created a constitutional monarchy, which vested a governmental authority in the property owning classes. These two developments reconfigured the British ruling class into an elite dominated by bankers, merchants, and commercial farmers. The effect was to unleash the full potential of British mercantile capitalism. When we look to Britain, the red parts are belong to Britain. Some parts of Africa, India, Australia, and America, as we see. And here we can see, here Britain, and the parts belong to Britain are India, Australia, and America. The transformation of the world that had begun around 1450 could then accelerate rapidly, as British armies and fleets created a vast colonial empire in India, North America, and West Indies, wealth flowed back to Britain and turned it into both an economic powerhouse and a geopolitical superpower. An outcome was that military competition with Britain wrecked the finances and the reputation of France's absolute monarchy. At the same time, the development of capitalism and a prosperous merchant and professional bourgeoisie within France created social forces with the potential to overthrow the monarchy and remodel society. The result was the French Revolution, and the revolution shook all the world. Nothing afterwards was ever quite the same. The second wave of bourgeoisie revolution we will study this week. First, consider the revolution in ideas, the Enlightenment movement that paved the way to French Revolution, and the major colonial revolt, American Revolution, which offered to French a model of implemented ideas. Next, we will examine the French Revolution. When we look to Enlightenment, here we see some parts in the map. The parts that was being transformed by a dynamic, fast-growing capitalist economy was based on commercial farming, maritime trade, new industries, and modern banking. London's growth is a measure of this change. Its population, which had stood at just over 100,000 in 1560, grew to 350,000 in 1640s, and we see that it will increase afterwards. The first part, 18th century Europe, was the southern and eastern Europe was trapped in feudal and absolutist past, where royal autocrats ruled traditional societies and led those and priest-ridden peasants which had barely changed since the Middle Ages. That part is, we can say, these parts, and between these two parts we see the third part, which was formed by an intermediate group. Here, feudal absolute survivors were interfaced with the burgeoning commercial capitalism. France was the supreme example. It had a growing merchant navy, an expanding colonial empire in India and the Americas, and an increasingly wealthy and assertive urban bourgeoisie. But France also had a royal autocracy, a powerful Catholic Church, a parasitic class of state-subsidized courtiers, an equally parasitic class of ancient titled landowners, a peasantry weighed down by feudal dues and tithes, and an internal trading system hampered by tolls, duties, and petty regulations. The growth of French capitalism meant that the contradictions could not be contained indefinitely, was brought them more rapidly to crisis. Point was the state's struggle for global supremacy with Britain. The population of Paris traveled between the mid-16th century and the early 19th century. This was a measure of the French economy's expansion. But in the same period, London's population grew to 12-fold, whereas Paris had been just twice the size of London in the mid-16th century. It was only half the size in the early 19th century. This was a measure of the greater dynamism of the British economy. The caveat of the problem was military competition between the two nation states. During the 7 Years' War, France lost its empire in India and the Americas to the British. Military defeat was the external expansion of a growing crisis. A revolution in ideas was its internal expression. Long before its overthrow in the Revolution of France, France's feudal absolutist ancient regime had been intellectually deconstructed. When we talk about ancient regime literally its meaning is old rule. That was the political and social system of the Kingdom of France from the late Middle Ages, 15th century, until the French Revolution. Political and social system of France, we can say also, prior to French Revolution. Under the regime, everyone was a subject of the King of France, as well as a member of an estate and province. All rights and status flowed from the social institutions divided into three orders: clergy, nobility, and the others. There was no national citizenships. The inability of ancient regime to maintain its ideological defenses exposed in reactionary character. A new wave of enlightenment thinking so completely swept away the accumulated ideological dirties of the past that even despots and dukes embraced rational and scientific ways of viewing the world with the enthusiasm of new converts. When we look to Enlightenment detailedly, it was a European intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in which ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity were synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West and that instigated revolutionary developments in arts, philosophy, and politics. Central to Enlightenment thought were the use and celebration of reason. That reason is very important in Enlightenment. The power by which humans understand the universe and improve their own condition. The goals of rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom, and happiness. The price of 7th century counter-revolution, which corresponded more or less with the counter-reformation in Austria, Italy, Spain, and also France, was that Holland, England, and Scotland had become the focal points of intellectual, scientific, and artistic advance by the end of the century. The received wisdom of holy texts was discarded in favor of observation, experiment, and reasoning. Isaac Newton, as all of you know, is an example in this context. Now had the freedom to solve the problems in physics that had puzzled Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo in earlier attempts to explain how the universe has worked. But the new realm of reason extended far beyond the natural sciences. The Dutch and the English revolutions had rejected the divine rights of kings in favor of the rights and prerogatives of elected representatives. But if the political order was not ordained by God, if humans created their own political order, what form should it take? We found the answer in the Putney debates. The Putney debates had revealed the dangers. In the absence of divine authority, people were liable to disagree about how power should be exercised. At Putney, those of a higher station had taken the view that none should have a say in the management of public affairs who had no permanent fixed interest. Others, speaking for the lower sort, had argued that no one had an obligation to obey that government that he had not had a voice to put himself under. Little wonder that revolutionary England had spawned political philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and also we can add some names to these. These thinkers, these philosophers grapple with these issues. In the event, the debate subsided with the settlements. England's fractured elite struck a deal and closed ranks against the lower orders. During the 18th century, as Whigs and Tories, the two main parties in Parliament, they may have continued squabbling over the spoils of office, becoming to the statistics of the day old corruption. But to the rest of society they presented a united front. By the end of the century, some crimes against property carried the death sentence in England. Unreformed French society, on the other hand, found no such resolution of urgent political questions. It was therefore that the Enlightenment blossomed. Its greatest achievement was the Encyclopedia, a 35-volume compendium of human knowledge and thought to which hundreds of leading intellectuals contributed to that. It had 25,000 copies. What gave the Enlightenment its subversive, politically correct character? We can say, irrespective of the relatively conservative inventions of many of its exponents, was its critique of institutions and practices that appeared irrational in the light of contemporary thinking. And what appeared irrational was usually that which was against the interests of the mercantile and professional bourgeoisie. Commerce and market-based relationships were breaking down. Networks of patronage, privilege, and influence. Monetary exchange was replacing entitlement based on inherited rank and estate. What seemed irrational to the new thinkers, therefore, was the church and its theology, the divine right claimed by the kings, and the political supremacy of a decaying class of titled place seekers. And when we look to enlightenment and private property, there are three important thinkers here: John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes. We have lecture on Thomas Hobbes, as you remember. In our first or in the second lecture, we have talked about Hobbes, his Leviathan. I hope you remember. Private property is perhaps one of the most important reasons for the state's existence. These social contract thinkers, Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, they critically evaluate the emergence of the state to protect private property. What of private property itself? Was it rational? Someone thinks that it is not. When we look at the answer of Jean-Jacques Rousseau about the rationality of private property, Rousseau says something like that, which we have in the lecture, in our physical lecture, we have talked about also this. The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all of us and the earth itself to nobody. The Enlightenment was a multidimensional intellectual movement, but its essence was radical critique, and anything and everything in human affairs that could not give an adequate account of itself in the court of free inquiry was open to challenge. And this, in the context of the late 18th century, riddled as it was with contradictions, filled with hallowed institutions that seemed to many monuments of superstition, was an ideological powder keg, especially so when the spirit of reason reached the lower sort. Then thrones might totter. According to Enlightenment thinkers, monarchy and succession have laid the world in blood and ashes. Freedom had been hunted around the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England had given her warning to depart. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary men and women were embracing radical ideas and engaging in a struggle to remodel the world. When we came to American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, also known as the American Revolution, arose from growing tensions between residents of Great Britain's 13 North American colonies and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown. The Revolutionary War, waged by the American colonies against Britain, influenced the political ideas and revolutions around the globe as a small fledgling nation won its freedom from the greatest military force of its time. This picture is from the American Boston Tea Party. We will talk about that party, what they did in the Boston. It will be our subject. Americans living in the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America thought of themselves as British subjects of George III. By the end of 18th century, by their own decisions and actions, they had made themselves free citizens of a new republic forged in revolution and war. In 1775, opposition became armed rebellion. Many of the participants of the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, including Benjamin Franklin, assumed that victory over the British would be accomplished with relative ease. In reality, as George Washington, who had been granted the command of the newly raised Continental Army, so the campaign would be long and difficult. Ultimately, independence could not be gained without foreign aid, especially French naval and financial support. The War of Independence, that was between 1775 and 1783, was fought on several fronts and in novel ways, with small-scale skirmishes involving light infantry and militia often as important as fixed battles. America formed the Continental Army, while Britain relied on German mercenaries as well as British and Irish troops. Following early American successes at Lexington, Concord and the Battle of Bunker's Hill, the British evacuated Boston by sea. The revolutionists failed to defeat the British forces in Canada, and in early 1776, the British General Howe arrived with 30,000 men, successfully retaking New York. Washington managed a morale-boosting victory at Trenton, but the British then took to Philadelphia. Other British forces moved down from Canada towards New York in an attempt to surround. The remaining British forces retreated from Philadelphia to New York and, believing the slave-only colonies more supportive of British rule, concentrated their campaign on the south, taking Charleston. More British victories followed, but in 1781 the Americans won military and financial support from the French. That was very important. The support of French to Americas changed all the things. Crucially, the French fleet secured the Chesapeake Bay against British reinforcements, and British forces under the command of General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, destroying and remaining British hope of eventual victory. Parliament voted to end the war, hearing news of the defeat. The 13 colonies became an independent federal state. King and Parliament had been swept away, and their place were President, Senate, and House of Representatives. Some men of wealth, they were loyalists and had backed the king, lost their fortunes. Others, who might once have run their affairs in the manner of feudal barons, found that their tenants were no longer differential. Women and black people, for them, the situation was very different. The states of Massachusetts and Vermont had abolished slavery altogether, and the other states will follow them. The change was not great as it might have been, far less in fact than many had hoped, for the American Revolution was not just a struggle for national independence between the American colonies and the British Empire. It was also a struggle between sorts of conditions of Americans, a struggle to determine what sort of republic they were fighting for. The problems began at the end of the 7 Years' War. The British had beaten the French and taken over their empire in India and Canada. In this, the Americans had played their part, colonial militias fighting alongside redcoat regulars to secure the western frontier of the colonies. Victory ended the French trade, and with it, American dependence on British military support. It also left the British government saddled with war debt and in need of tax rises to pay it off. British taxes on American trade were triple-pronged. They were intended to avoid levying higher taxes on British landowners, protect British commerce against foreign competition, and help pay off British debts. In a nutshell, the Sugar Act was 1764. The Stamp Act, it was in the 65, and the Thompson taxes, it was in the 67, and the Tea Act, which was in the 73 year, were designed to siphon the American wealth in the interest of the British ruling class. Had the Americans continued to pay these taxes, economic stagnation and underdevelopment will occur. That was the danger, countered by the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." They just want representation in the parliament. The Americans wanted to be represented in the parliament. British efforts were frustrated by direct actions. Though there were only 3 million Americans spread across the 13 colonies and only 1 in 20 lived in a town, they have come into a mass movement of resistance that made the British taxes unenforceable. The movement was built by meetings, parades, the burning of effigies, and the erection of liberty poles. Crowds confronted customs men and soldiers would be collaborators, were intimated official events, they were disrupted. In some cases, property was destroyed. Boycotts were enforced by a militant urban crowd of artisans, small traders, local farmers, and dissident intellectuals. Leading activists organized themselves as Sons of Liberty. In 1773, after an entire cargo of the East India Company tea was dumped in the sea by 100 activists, disguised as Native Americans. The Boston Tea Party, we are seeing in the picture. The British decided that a crackdown was in order. A Continental Congress, attended by representatives of all 13 colonies, agreed to continue the tea boycott. Local committees and local committees they were authorized to enforce this decision, and colonial militias were mobilized to back their civil power. The Continental Congress was dominated by big landowners and merchants. So too, at first, were most local communities, but the revolution of the elite soon gave the way to the revolution of the middle classes. Revolution requires mass action to support radical demands. Men of property have much to fear. These parts are very important. Many are tied into the existing economic system and profit from it. All will have fear that the common people, once roused against political authority, may be prompted to ask deeper questions about the social order as a whole. The strategy for many men of property was to keep pace with the movement in order to channel its energies. The first shot was fired in a small town, Lexington, and the war began. The colonial militias were supplemented by a continental army. They were funded by Congress and commanded by its appointee George Washington. It became the military expression of the embryonic United States. The militiamen defended their localities, but the Continentals waged national war. The British won most of the battles, but they lost the war. There were three main reasons for this. First, geography favored the revolutionaries. The American colonies comprised vast tracts of wilderness, which imposed a heavy logistical burden on the British and provided ideal terrain for embedded guerrilla resistance. Second, the Americans enjoyed strong and growing French support. At first, this took the form of supplies of arms, but later involved full-scale military intervention on both land and sea. The British were left struggling to keep operations going at the end of a long and vulnerable maritime supply line. And third, the revolutionaries organized themselves politically and militarily to wage all-out war. The core of the resistance was supplied by the mechanics, small traders, and backcountry farmers who came to dominate the local communities and militias. The British controlled only the territory their soldiers occupied. The rebels, however often they were beaten, could always retreat, recapitulate, and return to fight again. The Declaration of Independence of 1776 had asserted that all men are created equal, that they have inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the Constitution ensured not radical democracy and moral economy, but the rule of property, free markets, and a gilded elite landowners, merchant and bankers. So America's bourgeoisie revolution in this sense and in others was left unfinished. Above all, slavery remained in place, and in the decades to come it would expand into an immensely profitable economic place. When we came to French Revolution, on 14 July, a state prison on the east side of Paris, known as the Bastille, was attacked by an angry and aggressive mob. The prison had become a symbol of the monarchy, a dictatorial rule, and an event became one of the defining movements in the revolution that followed. The Bastille was an ancient fortress and a state prison in eastern Paris. It was a symbol of absolute monarchy. It loomed menacingly over streets inhabited by the city's working population of artisans, small traders, and general laborers. Like the monarchy, it seemed an immovable presence. On 14 July 1789, the people of Paris, who had been seizing arms wherever they could find them for 2 days, massed outside the Bastille and demanded its surrender. The defenders opened fire. During 3 hours of fighting, 83 people were killed, but the determination of the assault broke the defenders' morale and the gates were opened. The Bastille had been stormed to thwart a military coup by the French king against his own people. The insurrection broke the back of the absolute monarchy and transformed the self-declared National Assembly into the effective government of France. The National Assembly immediately abolished feudalism, passed a declaration of the rights of man, and created a new national guard. Towns across France followed the example of the capital and created new revolutionary authorities. When the news reached the countryside, it inspired an elemental rising of peasantry, the Great Fear. Hundreds of thousands of men marched on the chateau of their landlords and burnt the title deeds of feudal dues. In scores of local towns, the poor demonstrated against food shortages, price rises, and unemployment. The world had been turned upside down. An absolute monarchy, unchallenged for nearly 150 years, had been overthrown in 3 days of urban insurrection. The French Revolution had begun. For the next years, counter-revolutionary forces at home and abroad would attempt to destroy the achievement of the revolution. Again and again, the revolution would have to mobilize mass popular forces in its own defense. A royalist plot was being hatched. Its epicenter was the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They were in Versailles, outside Paris. So, 20,000 market women marched to Versailles, their menfolk trailing behind them, broke into the palace and forced the king to return to Paris, where he and his followers would be under popular surveillance. The victory of the market women consolidated the constitutional monarchy and ended the first phase of the French Revolution. Between 1688 and 1783, Britain and France had fought 5 long wars, lasting in total nearly 42 years. The locations of these conflicts had ranged from the forests of North America to the plains of India, though they had usually been centered in Europe. Because the British economy was growing faster than the French, and because the French usually had to fight the British at sea and their European allies on land, the French had lost their empire and ruined their economy. Even the cost of occasional victories had been too high. The French state had been bankrupted by its role in the American Revolutionary War. In its aftermath, the absolute monarchy was forced to attempt to reform the tax system. These basic facts must be placed in a wider context. Capitalism is a dynamic economic system whose competitive edge threatens traditional societies and states. Britain grew much faster than France during the 18th century because of the forces unleashed by the English Revolution. The French economy certainly grew at an estimated nearly 2% a year throughout the 18th century. And this was not enough to catch English economy. War taxation was already a massive burden on the working population, but the nobility and the clergy paid no tax at all. The key to reform was to make them pay their share. But when the king appointed a reforming ministry to rationalize the tax system, the parliament's aristocrats controlled the Supreme Courts in Paris, rejected their proposals. Many leading aristocrats and even called for mass demonstrations against the government. Their central demand was that an Estates General should be called to resolve the crisis. The Estates General of 1789 was the first to be convinced. It was formed of three chambers representing the three estates, nobility, clergy, and the commons. The election campaign for the commons reached very small town and village, drawing the masses into political action and releasing a torrent of grievances and demands. The third estate represented the overwhelmingly majority of the people, but it was dominated by the professional middle classes, especially lawyers, mainly because they had the necessary political skills. The Estates General met from April to June in 1789 at Versailles. The result was a political standoff. The king's ministers demanded tax reform, the delegates demanded redress of grievances, the Third Estate refused to recognize the spirit of the nobility and the clergy. When the Third Estate proclaimed itself a national assembly and invited the nobility and clergy to join it, the king locked them out of their hall. The delegates then convened in a nearby tennis court and swore an oath not to disperse until a constitution was granted. In response, the king sacked his leading reformist ministers and summoned 20,000 troops to Paris. The capital was already a ferment of political clubs and meetings, the streets awash with news sheets, pamphlets, and street corners orators. Some of the middle class electors who had been taking part in the selection of delegates to the Estates General met in the City Hall and formed themselves into a council or commune. But it was the intervention of the Paris crowd, predominantly young artisans, petty traders, and general laborers, that brought down the absolute monarchy. The crowd fraternized with the soldiers and won them over. The king did not dare send more soldiers into the city. The Bastille was successfully stormed. The peasant revolution, following the example of Paris and other large towns, was then decisive. France was a predominantly agricultural country and most soldiers were peasants. When the villagers attacked the chateau, there was no chance that the soldiers would fight for the landlords. The Third Estate had been joined by a minority of aristocrats and clergy to form the National Assembly. The relatively conservative majority favored a constitutional monarchy that would halt the revolution and safeguard property and privilege. It was led by the Marquis Lafayette, a general who had served into the American Revolutionary War. At first, during the revolution's honeymoon period, the more radical revolutionaries were marginalized, but their strength was growing amid the continuing ferment of propaganda and agitation. Some 250 newspapers were launched in the last 6 months of '89. Soon to emerge as the most popular was the former Dr. Jean-Paul Marat's "The Friend of People" name. Numerous radical clubs provided opportunities for debate about the way forward. The most famous were the Jacobins, dominated by the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, and the Cardairis, dominated by another lawyer, Georges Danton. In June 1791, the king attempted to flee to join the counter-revolutionary armies massing across the border. He was captured and brought back to Paris. But when, in the following month, ordinary Parisians queued up to sign a Republican petition in the field of Mars, Lafayette's National Guard opened fire and killed 50 of them. In the same place, exactly a year before, people had gathered on the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille in a carnival-like festival of federation. Now, a river of blood flowed between conservative constitutional monarchists like Lafayette and radical republicans like Marat, Robespierre, and Danton. The revolution was entering a new phase. Declaration of Human and Civil Rights of 1789. The first code was: men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on considerations of the common good. The aim of every political association is the preservation of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance of oppression. The principle of any sovereignty lies primarily in the nation. No corporate body, no individual may exercise any authority that does not expressly emanate from it. Liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of every man has no bounds other than those that ensure to the other members of society the enjoyment of these same rights. The law has the right to forbid only those actions that are injurious to society. Nothing that is not forbidden by law may be hindered, and no one may be compelled to do what the law does not ordain. The law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part, personally or through their representatives, in its making. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. All citizens, being equal in its eyes, shall be equally eligible to all high offices, public positions, and employments, according to their ability and without other distinction than that of their virtues and talents. No man may be accused, arrested, or detained except in the cases determined by the law and following the procedure that it has prescribed. The law must prescribe only the punishments that are strictly and evidently necessary, and no one may be punished except by virtue of a law drawn up and promulgated before the offense is committed and legally applied. As every man is presumed innocent until he has been declared guilty, if it should be considered necessary to arrest him, any undue harnish that is not required to secure his person must be severely curbed by law. No one may be disturbed on account of his opinions, even religious ones, as long as the manifestations of such opinions does not interfere with the established law and order. The free communication of ideas and of opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Any citizen may therefore speak, write, and publish freely, except what it is tantamount to the abuse of this liberty in the cases determined by law. To guarantee the rights of man and of the citizen as a public force is necessary. For the maintenance of the public force and for administrative expenses, a general tax is indispensable. But this tax must be equally distributed among all citizens in proportion to their ability to pay. All citizens have the right to ascertain by themselves or through their representatives the need for a public tax, to consent it freely, to watch over its use, and to determine its proportion, basis, collection, and ration. Society has the right to ask a public official for an accounting of his administration. Any society in which no provision is made for granting rights or for the separation of powers has no constitution. Since the right of property is inviolable and sacred, no one may be deprived thereof unless public necessity, legally ascertained, obviously requires it, and just and prior indemnity has been paid. These were the cause of Declaration of Human and Civic Rights. When we come to the Jacobin dictatorship, this is a famous picture of French Revolution. The revolutionary democratic dictatorship that was the culminating stage of the French Revolution. The dictatorship was the result of the popular uprising of 1793 that brought the Jacobins to power, hence it is designation which became established in historical life. Historical literature, sorry. It was supported by the revolutionary bloc consisting of the urban petite and middle bourgeoisie and the majority of the peasant and plebeian masses. The Jacobin dictatorship is the end of French Revolution. In the summer of 1792, the constitutional monarchy created by the urban insurrection 3 years earlier collapsed. Sorry. On 10 August, tens of thousands of sans-cloths federalists surrounded and attacked the Tudors, the king's Paris resistance. The sans-cloths, those without breeches, were treasured working people of Paris. They were organized in 48 sections. These were local assemblies, which functioned as electoral wards of the city council or commune. The sections had become organs of the participatory democracy for the artisans, small traders, and general laborers of Paris. The federals were volunteer soldiers from the provinces on their way to front for war had been declared earlier that year. They represented the cream of revolutionary activists from the rest of France. The National Guard, instead of defending the king, joined the insurrection, but the Swiss Guard stayed loyal and some 600 royalists and 370 revolutionists were killed in the fighting. Nearly 1,000 men died in this process. The place was overrun and the king arrested. In this insurrection, that was as decisive as that of the revolution. The constitution agreed in 1791 with voting rights tied to property ownership were overturned. The Legislative Assembly elected on this restricted franchise. The successor of the National Embassy of 1789 was dissolved and the National Convention was elected on the basis of adult male suffrage to frame of a new constitution. The convention, when it met, was dominated by Republicans who abolished the monarchy and declared a republic. The king was then tried and executed. 3 insoluble contradictions destroyed the constitutional monarchy of 1789 and 92. First, the majority of the nobility and clergy remained deeply hostile to the revolution, and they were intent on reversing it. The royal court became a centre of intrigue. Emigre armies were forming. The counter-revolution was a real and present danger. The second reason. Popular expectations, encouraged by the events of 1789, had been disappointed. Hopes of political empowerment and social reform had been dashed. Instead, there were food shortages, inflation, and unemployment. The result was rioting in Paris and elsewhere. Third reason. There was a desperate attempt to paper over growing splits with the regime. An unholy alliance of political forces had agreed to declare war against the revolution's foreign armies. The king and his supporters hoped the counter-revolution would prevail. Lafayette and the constitutional monarchies hoped to lead a crusade that would unite the nation. The Girondins, moderate Republicans they were, hoped to be swept to power on a wave of national enthusiasm. But all were disappointed. The war backfired. Conservative generals defected to the enemy. The French suffered serious defeats. The enemy commander declared that he would impose exemplary vengeance and hand over the city of Paris to soldiers and punish the rebels as they deserved. These tensions culminated in the insurrection of 10 August. The wave of popular enthusiasm that made it possible then flowed into the new volunteer army being formed. Out of the city, and still more audacity proclaimed Danton a newly elected member. On 20 September 1792 at Valmy, it was a place in northeastern France, the French Revolutionary Army halted the advance of the invaders. It was on the following day that the convention abolished the monarchy. But the Girondin government was now as eager to halt the revolution as its predecessor had been. The central contradiction of the bourgeoisie revolution reasserted itself. Once in power, the moderate republicans prioritized the defense of property against the popular movement. "Your property is threatened," declared one of the Girondin leaders. "A hydra of anarchy is at large," proclaimed another. Unless recurrent insurrections were stopped, warned a third, Paris would be destroyed. But the counter-revolutionary threat had not been expunged. On the contrary, by spring 1793, Britain had joined the war against France. There were royalist risings in the western Vendée region. Foreign armies were again advancing on Paris from the northeast, and the Girondin general Dumouriez had deserted the enemy. Robespierre called on the people to revolt again. May the Paris sections met and elected a new commune. Mass demonstrations surrounded the convention and compelled it to arrest some of the Girondin leaders. From then on, the purged assembly was dominated by the Jacobins. The Committee of Public Safety, a body of 12 men elected by the convention, now became the effective government. The committee reported to the convention once a week and was subject to re-election once a month. Three prominent Jacobins, Robespierre, Louis de Saint-Just, and Georges Couthon, became its guiding figures. They will later be killed. The committee established a total war economy with mass conscription, nationalized war industries, and progressive taxation. Forced loans were imposed on the rich. The estates of emigres and the church were confiscated, divided into small plots, this is important, and distributed to the peasantry. The estates of church were distributed to the peasants. This can be maybe the most important economic result of the revolution, we can say. A policy of terror was employed to deter counter-revolution. The guillotine erected in the Place de la Concorde in central Paris became a symbol of revolutionary justice. Jacobin authorities in the capital and elsewhere executed several thousand between September 1793 and July 1794. Why was this necessary? The terror was a product of two factors. First, the threat from the counter-revolution was extreme and ever-present. In the towns and villages they captured, counter-revolutionaries carried out wholesale massacres of Republicans. They almost certainly killed far more than Jacobins. Had they been victorious, they would have drowned the revolution in blood. The death penalty was necessary to discourage counter-revolutionary activism. For some thinkers or some things about this. The second factor, according to some of the thinkers, is peculiar to the highly contradictory character of the Jacobin regime. The regime wobbled on a narrow and unstable base, because the Jacobins did not so much represent a specific class as specific historical moment, then opposing class forces were finely balanced. Most of the bourgeoisie, former royalists, constitutional monarchists, and moderate republicans had now gone over to the counter-revolution. Only the most radical minority supported the Jacobin dictatorship. Its leaders were mainly professional men of modest means. Their rule rested largely on the support of the sans-culotte popular movement. The revolutionary emergency demanded radical measures which most of the property-only classes feared and resented. This strengthened the counter-revolution. At the same time, the Committee of Public Safety was an elected body of the convention, and the Jacobin leaders remained strong defenders of private property as the base of society. This put a strain on the government's relationship with its most radical supporters. In the political military emergency of the republics, with the survival of the revolutionary regime at stake, the guillotine became the arbiter of these contradictions. As well as outright counter-revolutionaries, the terror devoured its own children, striking down revolutionaries hostile to dictatorship. In March 1794, the left-wing Herbertists were executed, and the next month it was the turn of the right-wing Indulgents. In this way, the centrist Committee of the Public Safety sought to maintain its increasingly precarious political balance. The effect was to paralyze resistance for a few months, but only shrinking the regime's mass base. The social democratic promise of the regime was disappointed, and the popular movement declined. The revolution had frozen over, declared Saint-Just. Meanwhile, on the frontiers, the remodeled French revolutionary armies had driven back the invaders. The emergency that had given rise to the Jacobin dictatorship was coming to an end. Those sections of the bourgeoisie that had supported it out of necessity now drew back. The convention was turning against the committee. The revolution was about to go into reverse. The crisis broke in July 1794. And after months, Napoleon came to the power, The Brumaire coup ended the French Revolution, but the revolution did not turn back. On the contrary, Napoleon defended and reinforced the basic achievements. Napoleon was, like Cromwell, was a part of the revolution, not an enemy of the revolution. Gratitude is not a political attitude. With internal revolt suppressed and the French army occupying Brussels, the revolutionary bourgeoisie turned on its Jacobin survivors. Sensing that the power was slipping away, Robespierre called for another mass purge. In 1794, his enemies in the convention hauled him down, and then issued an arrest warrant against him and his political allies. The Jacobins retreated to the Stiol and called for a revolutionary journey, but support was patchy. The regime has attacked its own supporters, executing left activists, lifting a ban on food speculation and imposing wage cuts. Only 16 of the 48 pirate sections sent armed men to Stiol. These dispersed after several hours, standing around without leadership. The Jacobin leaders were then arrested, tried, and executed. Robespierre, Saint-Just, Couthon, and 18 others were guillotined. The distractions of Robespierre's centrist dictatorship shifted power decisively to the right, not to the left. Thermidor was a reactionary coup. The streets filled with gangs of rich young thugs. A mob shut down the Jacobin club. A property qualification for voting was introduced. A white terror raged. Desperate risings of the Sons of Cloth were crushed in April and May 1795. The balance tipped farther to the right, and resurgent royalists attempted a coup in 1795 of October. This was crushed by a young officer. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. But its occurrence revealed the instability of the Thermidorian regime. Thermidor had not been a counter-revolution. It had been a bourgeoisie reaction against radical democracy within the revolution. But by demoralizing and demobilizing the mass movement, the bourgeoisie had made royalist counter-revolution more likely. At the coup of Brumaire, when Napoleon, the Republic's most illustrious general seized power. The new First Consul had himself crowned emperor in 1804. The coup of Brumaire ended the French Revolution, but, as we said, it did not reverse it. On the contrary, it consolidated and defended its essential gains. Napoleon, as we said, he was like Cromwell. He was a soldier of revolution. He was not a nemesis. After the revolution and by Napoleon, feudal dues had gone for good and the peasants kept their land. The economy remained free of internal customs. A national system of administration had been established. There was equality under the law, and the church had been separated from the state. Yes, dear friends, we ended this week with Napoleon. I hope it's good for you. Hope to see you next week with a new subject. Bye.